all misses aren't here. This is your Math 3, Week 3, Lesson 3. And it's all about the midline and amplitude of a trig graph. So we've been working with a lot of trigonometry. We've been using the unit circle. But we want to make our way back to working with these trig graphs that we have seen a little bit of in the last chapter before spring break. So just as a bit of a refresher, just kind of to remind you about the different pieces of these waves. So this is a sine wave, this is an upside down cosine wave, but if you start somewhere else, it's exactly the same thing as a sine wave. So the cosine and sine waves, we're not too worried about their names or which is which just right now. But one thing that we do want to look at today has to do with the midline and the amplitude. So the midline is the middle line that cuts the graph in half. So we're talking about a line that is horizontal. And one way of thinking about it is that it's the average of the maximum y and the minimum y. So here on this top left graph, if we're thinking about the midline, well, you might be able to see it because you can see that, okay, this x-axis cuts the graph exactly in half. But if you're wanting to think about, well, what if I want to take the average, or what if I want like a surefire formula for this? Well, the maximum y height is 1. The minimum y height is -1. So if I take 1 plus -1 and divide by 2, I'm finding the average of them. Well, 1 plus -1 is 0. 0 divided by 2 is 0. So the midline is at y equals 0 for that top left graph. For the top right graph, if we're looking for that midline, again, you might be able to see it. You might be able to spot it. But if you're not sure where it is, well, use that same formula. The maximum y is at a height of 4. The minimum y is at a height of -2. So if I take 4 plus -2 and divide by 2 to find their average, 4 plus -2 is 2, and 2 divided by 2 is 1. So y equals 1 is the midline of that top right graph. So if it's not drawn in for you, I would encourage you to go about drawing it in. So y equals 1 is the halfway there. Y equals 0, well, that's the x-axis. So the midline is important to find first because then it also helps us find the amplitude. So the amplitude is the extent of deviation from the midline. How high above or how low below the midline does this graph get during its wave? Well, so on this first graph, from the midline up to the peak, that's a deviation of 1 unit. So the amplitude would be equal to 1 on this graph. Here on the second graph, if we're looking at our midline and looking up to the peak, well, from 1 up to 4, that's an amplitude of 3. So that's definitely one way to do it, an easy way to find amplitude. But if you're looking for a formula and you think that might be easier, this formula is not an average, but it is taking the maximum y minus the minimum y and dividing by 2. So it's not finding the halfway point, it's finding half of the total deviation from top to bottom, because our amplitude is just one of those two parts, it's not both of them. So here on that top left graph, if I take my maximum y, 1, minus my minimum y, which is -1, so you get a double negative there, and divide by 2, 1 minus -1 is 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. That's the amplitude. That's the deviation above or below that midline. So there are a couple of ways to go about working through finding the midline and finding the amplitude. And so you can decide on which one works best for you. So on Delta Math, you'll be asked a few questions like, write the equation of the midline and find the amplitude. Maybe on different problems. They might not be together necessarily. So here's an example of a wave. And so I'm looking at -1, -2, -3, -4. And so you might have an idea that here is my midline right here. And if you're not sure, once again, you should definitely use your maximum y and minimum y and find the average. So the equation of this midline is y equals -3. That's the midline. Meanwhile, the amplitude, that deviation from the midline up to the peak or down to the lowest valley is an amplitude of 1. So it never hurts to write the equation in full, write a label for amplitude. That way you aren't getting mixed up between what these two are. So use this information or the formulas, head on over to Delta Math and practice these problems.